At 4 minutes past 6 on a warm June evening, the ground under Venezuela tore open. Then, 39 seconds later, it tore open again. 2 giant earthquakes, back to back, a twin so rare that scientists have a special name for it. Tonight, we trace the cracks running beneath a nation of nearly 30 million, the buildings that folded in seconds, the baby found alive under the rubble, and a ground that still refuses to go still. If this pulls you in, like and subscribe. Stay close. We are only getting started. Picture a normal Wednesday in northern Venezuela. The sun is dropping. Families are cooking dinner. Kids are finishing homework. Traffic crawls along the coast road below the mountains. At 4 minutes past 6 in the evening, everything changes in an instant. The ground begins to move. A magnitude 7.2 earthquake rips along a fault buried deep under the state of Yaracuy, about 100 miles west of the capital. For anyone standing on that soil, the world turns to liquid. Walls sway, shelves empty themselves onto the floor, car alarms scream in the streets. People do what people always do. They run for a doorway, a table, the open air. They start counting the seconds, waiting for the shaking to fade. It fades. For a heartbeat, there is relief. The worst is over, they think. They are wrong. 39 seconds later, the earth strikes again. And this time it hits harder. A second earthquake, magnitude 7.5, erupts from almost the exact same spot. Its centre sits within about 6 miles of the first. If you drew both on a map, your thumb would cover them at once. The 2 ruptures were practically neighbours. Think about how short 39 seconds is. It is less time than it takes to tie your shoes and cross a room. It is barely long enough to understand that an earthquake is happening at all. People who had just stumbled outside, who had just started to breathe again, were caught by a second blow before their hearts had slowed down. Some had run back inside to grab a phone, a pet, a grandparent. They were still in the doorway when the walls came down. Seismologists later measured the depths. The first quake began about 12 miles below the surface. The second began even closer to the top, around 6 miles down. Shallow earthquakes shake the ground harder, because their energy has less distance to travel before it reaches the people living above. So the second quake was both stronger and closer to the surface. It was the knockout punch after the jab. Scientists have recorded plenty of huge earthquakes over the years: Chile, Japan, Nepal, Turkey. What made this event so strange was the pairing. 2 massive earthquakes, seconds apart, on faults sitting side by side, delivering nearly matching blows. That almost never happens. When it does, the ground shakes for far longer than a single quake ever could, and buildings that might have survived one shock get demolished by the second. By the time the earth finally settled, entire streets had folded. Apartment towers that stood tall at 6 o'clock lay in heaps of concrete by 5 past. Dust rose over the coast like fog, and across the region, hundreds of thousands of people crawled out of the dark to a question no one could yet answer. What had just happened to them? The answer has a name, and that name describes one of the rarest and most dangerous ways the planet can attack the people living on top of it. Scientists studying the Venezuela disaster kept using one strange word: a doublet. It sounds almost gentle, like a musical note or a card trick. What it describes is one of the most unsettling patterns in all of earthquake science. Most large earthquakes work in a predictable rhythm. First comes the main shock, the big one, the release of energy that people feel and remember. Then come the aftershocks, a long tail of smaller tremors that fade over days and weeks as the crust settles, one giant followed by many small ones. That is the normal shape of a seismic event. A doublet breaks that rhythm. In a doublet, 2 earthquakes of nearly the same size strike close together in time and place. They are near twins. Their seismic waves, the invisible ripples that race through the rock, look almost identical when scientists print them out. Their origin points underground sit close together. Their strength lands in the same range. If a single main shock is a lightning strike, a doublet is lightning striking the same tree twice in under a minute. Here is why that matters for the people above. When you build a house or a tower, engineers design it to survive a certain amount of shaking. A well-built structure can bend a little, absorb the energy, and stay standing through one earthquake. But that same building is now wounded, Its joints are loosened, its concrete is cracked, its steel is strained. It survived the first blow by using up its strength. Then, before crews can even react, before the dust is cleared, before anyone can escape, the second earthquake arrives. And it slams into structures that have already spent everything they had. A building that would have held through one quake collapses under two. This is exactly what turned the Venezuela event from a disaster into a catastrophe. The rarity is the frightening part. Seismologists comb through more than a century of records and find only a handful of true doublets of this size. They are the exceptions, the outliers, the events that make veteran scientists lean forward and stare at their screens. When two enormous earthquakes fire in the same neighborhood within a minute, something unusual is happening deep in the earth. One quake is reaching out and pulling the trigger on another, and that raises a chilling question. If one earthquake can wake its neighbor, how many neighbors are down there waiting? A fault does not exist alone. It sits inside a family of cracks, each one holding its own load of stored pressure. When one snaps, it shoves and squeezes the rock around it. Sometimes that shove is enough to push a nearby fault past its own breaking point. That is the real terror hiding inside the word doublet. It hints that the ground is not passive. It is connected. It talks to itself in the language of pressure and rupture. And in Venezuela, on that June evening, one fault spoke and a second one answered in under 40 seconds. To understand how that conversation started, we have to go back to the exact moment the first crack gave way, and the ordinary human world it shattered. Every disaster has a clock frozen at the moment it began. For Venezuela, that clock reads 4 minutes past 6 in the evening on the 24th of June. It was one of the worst possible times. Think about where people are at 6 in the evening. They are home from work, children are back from school, grandparents are settled in their chairs, dinner is cooking on stoves in millions of kitchens, in a country where so many people live stacked in tall apartment blocks along the coast and through the capital. 6 in the evening means the buildings are full, packed, occupied floor to floor. If the earthquake had struck at 3 in the morning, most people would have been asleep in low bedrooms, and rescuers would have known roughly where to search. If it had struck at noon on a weekday, many would have been out in open streets, in schoolyards, in parks. But 6 in the evening caught families together inside their homes, in the exact structures that were about to fail. The coast that took the hardest blow is one of the most crowded strips of land in the country. Below steep green mountains, the sea sparkles, and between the two, people crammed decades of construction into narrow space. Apartment towers rise close together. In the state of La Guaira, right on that coast, the shaking would prove almost unsurvivable for the buildings themselves. For the first few seconds, many people did not even realize how serious it was. Venezuelans know small tremors. The ground shivers now and then, rattles a few windows and stops. So when the shaking began, some waited it out, expecting it to pass like all the others. That instinct, born from 100 harmless tremors, cost precious seconds. Because this was not one of the small ones. A man named Simon Medina was not on the coast when it happened. He was in a town about 14 miles away. He felt the ground move, felt it hard, but he had no idea just how violent it had been where his family lived. Later he would travel to the coast with relatives, searching the rubble of an apartment building for his mother and his brother, digging with gloves and a shovel and a pickaxe, hoping to find anything at all. Even a paper, even a belonging, he said, would be something. That gap between feeling a quake and understanding a quake played out across the entire region. People felt the shaking in states far from the centre. They felt it in the capital, in tall towers that swayed and emptied as residents fled down stairwells into the streets. Word spread slowly at first, then all at once, something enormous had happened on the coast. As night fell over Venezuela, the true scale began to surface. Streets that had been ordinary at 6 o'clock were now canyons of broken concrete. Power failed in neighbourhood after neighbourhood, dropping whole districts into darkness. Families stood outside in the warm night air, afraid to go back inside, listening for the groan of buildings that might still fall. The clock had stopped at 4 minutes past 6, but the earth had not finished, and the reason the second quake hit harder than the first takes us straight into the strange physics of what was happening far below their feet. Common sense says a follow-up should be weaker. The big shock comes first, then the smaller ones trail behind. Venezuela flipped that expectation on its head. The second quake was the stronger of the two. The first earthquake measured magnitude 7.2, the second measured 7.5. That difference might look small on paper. It is enormous in reality. The scale scientists use to measure earthquakes is not a simple ruler where each step adds the same amount. Each whole number represents a jump of more than 30 times the energy released. So the gap between 7.2 and 7.5 means the second quake unleashed roughly twice the raw power of the first. Now stack that on top of everything the first quake had already done, and you begin to see the trap that closed on the region. There was a second reason the follow-up hit so hard, and it lay in the depth. The first rupture started about 12 miles underground. The second started much shallower, around 6 miles down. Depth changes everything about how an earthquake feels at the surface. Energy from a deep quake has to climb through miles of rock before it reaches people, and that rock soaks up some of the punch along the way. A shallow quake delivers its violence almost directly to the surface, with far less rock to blunt it. So the second earthquake carried two advantages at once: more energy and a shorter path to the people above. It was like the difference between a punch thrown from across the room and one thrown from 6 inches away. Both are dangerous. Only one knocks you flat. Picture the ground itself in that instant. When a shallow, powerful earthquake strikes, the soil can behave in ways that seem impossible. Loose, water-heavy ground can briefly act like a liquid, a process where solid earth loses its strength and buildings sink or tilt as if set on pudding. Firm land can crack open. The violent up and down and side-to-side motion can snap the columns that hold a building upright. And remember the timing. The structures taking that second stronger blow had already been rattled by the first. Their walls were cracked, their frames were strained. Engineers describe buildings as having a kind of budget of strength to spend during shaking. The first quake spent much of that budget. The second quake arrived to find the account nearly empty. This is the cruel arithmetic that made the doublet so deadly. A magnitude 7.2 on its own would have been a serious disaster. A magnitude 7.5 on its own would have been worse. But the two together, the second larger and shallower and striking a wounded landscape, multiplied the destruction far beyond what either could have done alone. Survivors describe the sensation as two separate monsters. The first threw them off their feet. The second, when they thought it was over, felt like the earth itself had decided to finish the job. Many who lived through both said the same thing. They never imagined a second one would come. They had no reason to. Nothing in their experience prepared them for the ground striking twice. But the earth had a reason. The first quake did not simply happen and stop. It reached out and changed the pressure on the rock around it, and that reaching out is what pulled the trigger on the monster that followed. Here is the question that fascinated scientists most. Why did the second earthquake happen at all? Two giant ruptures seconds apart side by side is far too neat to be coincidence. Something connected them, and working out that something reveals how earthquakes can wake each other up. Deep underground, faults are cracks in the Earth's crust where two masses of rock press against each other. Over years and centuries, the plates that make up the surface of the planet grind slowly past one another. Along a fault, that motion gets stuck. The rock locks in place, held by friction, while the pressure keeps building behind it. Think of bending a wooden ruler further and further. For a long time it holds, then it snaps. That snap is an earthquake. When the first Venezuela fault snapped, it released the pressure it had been storing. But releasing pressure in one place does something surprising. It shifts the load onto the rock nearby. Imagine a crowded shelf where one support suddenly gives way. The weight it was carrying does not vanish. It redistributes onto the supports on either side, and now those supports carry more than before. That is what the first earthquake did to its neighbour. Scientists believe the first rupture increased the stress on a second fault sitting right beside it. This nearby fault was already loaded with its own stored pressure, already close to its own breaking point. The sudden jolt from the first quake was the final shove. Within 39 seconds, the second fault could hold no longer, and it snapped in turn. What makes the story even sharper is the geometry. The second fault sat closer to the surface than the first. It was primed and shallow, a loaded weapon waiting near the top of the crust. When the pressure from the first rupture arrived, it found that shallow fault ready to fail, so the trigger did not just cause a second quake, it caused a second quake in the worst possible position, near the surface, where its violence would reach people almost undiluted. Scientists call this process stress transfer. One earthquake changes the forces on the rock around it, and sometimes that change is enough to push a neighbouring fault over the edge. It happens more often than people realise, usually spread over days or weeks. What stunned researchers in Venezuela was the speed. Under 40 seconds. The two events were so tightly linked that the second was practically an echo of the first, an echo powerful enough to level cities. This is why the doublet mattered so much. It was living proof that faults are not isolated. They are wired together by the pressure they share. Break one, and you may hand its stored energy to the next in line. In Venezuela, that handoff happened in the time it takes to read this sentence, and it forces a question that still hangs over the region today. If the first quake could load the second fault, did the second quake, in turn, load a third? Somewhere out there, along the same tangle of cracks, could another fault be sitting a little closer to failure tonight because of what happened on the 24th of June? To answer that, we need to meet the giant scar responsible for it all. A crack so long it slices across the entire top of a nation. Every earthquake has an address. The address for this disaster is a colossal crack in the crust called the Boconó Fault. To understand why Venezuela shook, you have to understand this scar, because it has been shaping the country's fate for thousands of years. The Boconó Fault is part of a much larger system that stretches for more than 800 miles. It runs from the high Andes Mountains in western Venezuela, cuts diagonally across the north of the country, and continues all the way toward the island of Trinidad in the east. Trace it on a map, and it looks like a stitch sewn across the top of South America, holding two enormous pieces of the planet together. Along that stitch, the rock is under constant strain. The fault is where two of the Earth's great tectonic plates meet and slide past each other. That sliding is slow, only a fraction of an inch each year, about the speed your fingernails grow. But slow does not mean gentle. Over centuries, that steady creep builds an unimaginable amount of stored energy, waiting to be released in sudden, violent jolts. The June earthquake struck at a spot where the Boconó system tangles with another set of cracks called the San Sebastian Fault. Near the coast, these two systems converge, creating a knotted, complicated zone of overlapping faults. In a place like that, the stress does not follow one clean line. It spreads across a web of cracks, any of which can fail. That knotted geometry is a big part of why two faults so close together could rupture almost at once. For the people of Venezuela, the Boconó Fault is a quiet giant. Most of the time it does nothing they can feel. Cities grow along it. Roads cross it. Millions of people live their entire lives on top of it without ever thinking about the pressure winding tighter beneath their feet. It is easy to forget a danger that stays silent for generations. But the fault keeps its own calendar, and it is written in centuries. Every so often the strain reaches its limit and the rock lets go. When that happens near a populated coast, near a capital city of millions, the result is the kind of destruction Venezuela just witnessed. Geologists have studied this scar for decades, mapping its twists and measuring its slow motion. They know it is one of the most important active faults in all of South America. They know it has produced great earthquakes before, and they know, with certainty, that it will produce more. The only question that has ever been open is when. What makes the Boconó especially dangerous is where it runs. It does not lie out in an empty desert or under an ocean far from land. It cuts directly through the beating heart of the country, past its most crowded regions, close to its capital. The fault and the people are neighbours, sharing the same ground, one of them capable of erasing the other in a single evening. On the 24th of June, the giant stirred, and to understand the force it unleashed, we have to zoom out even further, past the fault itself to the two vast slabs of planet grinding against each other far below. To see the true engine behind the Venezuela earthquakes, you have to imagine the planet not as solid rock, but as a cracked shell. The outer layer of the Earth is broken into enormous slabs called tectonic plates. They fit together like the pieces of a shattered eggshell, and they're always moving. Two of these giants meet beneath northern Venezuela. To the north sits the Caribbean plate, carrying the sea and its islands. To the south sits the South American plate, carrying the vast continent. These two slabs have been pressed against each other for millions of years, and they do not move in the same direction. They grind sideways past one another, like two ships scraping hull to hull as they pass in a narrow channel. That sideways grinding is called a strike-slip boundary. The plates slide horizontally, one creeping east, the other creeping west, along the line where they meet. And the line where they meet, along the top of Venezuela, is exactly where the Boconó and San Sebastian faults run. The faults are the visible wounds. The plate motion is the deep, patient force pushing them. The speed is almost comically slow. The two plates slide past each other at roughly the rate your fingernails grow, less than half an inch a year. It sounds harmless, but multiply that tiny motion across thousands of years and across a boundary stretching hundreds of miles, and the energy stored becomes staggering. The plates do not glide smoothly. They stick, locked by friction, while the pressure keeps mounting behind the jam. Then, all at once, the jam breaks, and centuries of stored motion release in seconds. That release is an earthquake, and the bigger the jam, the longer it has been stuck, the more violent the eventual snap. The June doublet was the sound of a long-locked section of that plate boundary finally letting go, all the pressure of decades unleashed in less than a minute. Here is a detail that surprises many people. The border between these two plates is not a single, tidy crack. Across northern Venezuela, it is a broad, messy zone, a smear of many faults rather than one clean seam. The motion between the plates gets shared out among all these cracks, spread across a wide band of country. That is why earthquakes here can pop up on different faults, sometimes close together, sometimes far apart, all of them part of the same great grinding at the boundary. This shared, smeared boundary is central to the tragedy. Because the motion is spread across many faults, no single crack carries all the strain. Each one loads slowly, quietly, in its own time, and when one fails, it can shift stress onto its neighbours in the smear, exactly the chain reaction that produced two quakes in 39 seconds. For the people living above, none of this is visible. They see mountains, coastline, cities, sky. They do not see the two continents' worth of rock straining against each other far below, storing the energy that will one day come for their homes. The border is invisible right up until the moment it announces itself in the most terrifying way possible. Understanding that smeared, tangled boundary is the key to the next piece of the puzzle, because the specific way northern Venezuela's faults are arranged made this doublet almost destined to happen the way it did. Most people imagine a fault line as a single crack, like a scratch drawn across a table. Clean, simple. One line you could walk along. The reality beneath Venezuela is far messier, and that mess is a large part of why the disaster unfolded the way it did. Along the top of the country, the border between the Caribbean and South American plates does not run as one neat seam. It spreads out into a wide belt of many faults, running roughly parallel, weaving and crossing, sharing the strain between them. Scientists call this a broad boundary zone. Picture not a single rope, but a frayed cable, dozens of threads bundled loosely together, each one bearing part of the load. This frayed arrangement changes how earthquakes behave. When strain builds along a single clean fault, it tends to release in one place at one time. But when strain is spread across a bundle of faults sitting close together, failure in one thread can tug at the others. The cracks are neighbours. They feel each other, and under the right conditions they can fail in quick succession, one triggering the next. That is precisely the setup that existed where the June earthquake struck. The rupture happened near where the Boconó system tangles with the San Sebastian system, a zone thick with overlapping cracks. Two faults sat close enough that when the first let go, its jolt reached the second almost instantly. In a place with a single clean fault, that second rupture might never have happened. In this tangled belt it was waiting to happen. The smeared boundary also explained something that confused early observers. The aftershocks did not line up along one tidy trace. They scattered across a wide area, clustering here and there, popping up in different spots across the northern states. That scattering is the signature of a broad boundary zone. The strain is not concentrated in one line, so the settling is not concentrated either. The whole frayed cable adjusts at once. There is a hidden danger in this geometry that goes beyond any single earthquake. Because the motion is shared across many faults, some of those faults sit quiet for a very long time, storing pressure while attention falls elsewhere. People forget them, cities grow over them, and then one day, one of the forgotten threads reaches its limit. A fault that has slept for a century can wake with terrible force, precisely because it has had so long to load. For engineers and city planners, the smeared boundary is a nightmare to prepare for. If there were one clear fault, you could map it, mark a danger line, and build carefully on either side. But a broad zone of many cracks means the danger is spread everywhere across the northern belt. There is no single line to avoid. The risk soaks into the whole region. This is the invisible truth beneath Venezuela's coast and capital. The people are living not on top of one fault, but on top of a whole family of them, bundled together, sharing the strain, capable of surprising everyone with which thread snaps next. The June doublet was two of those threads failing together. And when they failed, the place that suffered most was a narrow strip of coast where crowded buildings met the full fury of the shaking. A place where roughly 80 of every 100 structures came down. If you want to understand how a doublet turns into a catastrophe, look at one coastal state, La Guaira, a thin ribbon of land pressed between steep mountains and the Caribbean Sea, just north of the capital. When the earthquake struck, this narrow strip suffered a blow so complete it stunned even veteran disaster workers. By the reckoning of those surveying the wreckage, roughly 80 out of every 100 buildings in the hardest hit parts of La Guaira collapsed or were left too broken to enter. Stop and picture that. Walk down a street of 10 buildings, and 8 of them are rubble or ruins. Nearly the entire built world of a place, gone in under a minute. La Guaira was vulnerable long before the ground moved. It sits on that crowded coast where flat land is scarce, squeezed between the sea and the mountains. Over the decades, people built wherever they could, stacking homes tight, rising up in apartment blocks because there was nowhere to spread out. Much of that construction went up fast, in an era before modern earthquake rules, on ground that would prove treacherous when it started to shake. The coast also carries a haunting memory. Years before, this same region suffered a catastrophe of a different kind, when torrents of mud and rock roared down the mountains and buried coastal communities. The people of La Guaira are no disaster. They have rebuilt before, and now, once again, they found their homes turned to ruin. This time by the earth itself rather than the water rushing off it. When the shaking hit, the tight packing of buildings made everything worse. Structures standing close together can knock into each other as they sway, hammering their neighbours. Narrow streets became death traps as facades peeled off and crashed down, and with roads blocked by debris and power cut across the region, the coast was left dark and isolated, cut off at the exact moment it needed help most. Simon Medina came to La Guaira to search for his mother and brother, digging through the collapsed remains of their apartment building with hand tools. He was one of countless people who converged on the coast in those first frantic hours and days, clawing at concrete with whatever they could find, calling names into the gaps, straining to hear a voice answer back. The scale of collapse in La Guaira tells a hard truth about earthquakes. The shaking itself rarely kills people directly. What kills them is what falls on them, and in a place where nearly every building failed, there was almost nowhere safe to be. Indoors meant falling walls, the narrow streets meant falling facades. The disaster left few refuges. Rescue teams faced an impossible job. 80% collapse across a populated coast means thousands of separate sites, each one potentially holding trapped survivors, each one requiring careful, dangerous digging by hand to avoid triggering further collapse. With every hour, the chance of finding someone alive slipped lower. And the aftershocks kept coming, threatening to bring down whatever still stood. La Guaira became the clearest, cruelest picture of what the doublet did to Venezuela. Yet it also pointed to a deeper cause, one that would repeat across the region and up into the capital itself. Because the true killer in this disaster was hiding in plain sight, in the very walls people trusted to keep them safe. There is a phrase that echoes through earthquake science, repeated after nearly every great disaster. Earthquakes do not kill people. Buildings do. It sounds harsh. It is one of the most important truths in the entire field, and Venezuela proved it once again in the most painful way. An earthquake shakes the ground. That shaking, on its own, is survivable. If you were standing in an open field when the June quake struck, you would have been thrown off your feet, frightened beyond words, but almost certainly alive. The danger comes from what humans build on top of that ground. When walls crack, floors pancake, and concrete rains down, the shaking becomes a killer. The building is the weapon. In Venezuela, far too many of the weapons were already primed. The capital and the coast grew rapidly through the middle of the last century, throwing up homes and towers at a furious pace to house a booming population. Much of that construction predates the modern earthquake codes that engineers now know can save lives. Older buildings were designed for the weight of daily life, for gravity pulling straight down, without the reinforcement needed to survive the violent sideways whipping of a major quake. Modern earthquake-resistant buildings are clever things. Engineers weave steel through the concrete so it can bend without shattering. They tie columns and beams together so the whole structure moves as one, flexing like a tree in wind rather than snapping like a dry twig. They design the ground floors carefully because a weak first story can let an entire tower collapse straight down onto itself, floor slamming onto floor. Many older Venezuelan buildings had none of these protections. Their concrete was brittle, their steel was thin or poorly placed. Their ground floors, often opened up for shops or parking, were weak points waiting to fail. When the doublet hit, these structures did the deadliest thing a building can do. They came down fast, straight down, trapping everyone inside before they could reach the door. Engineers have a grim name for this pattern: pancake collapse. Each floor drops onto the one below, stacking the concrete slabs like pancakes with almost no space between them. Survivors caught in a pancake collapse have terribly small pockets to live in, and rescuers face agonizing work trying to reach them without bringing down more weight. The cruelest part is that this outcome was predictable. Across the world, engineers see the same story repeat. In city after city, the deadliest earthquakes are the ones that strike old, poorly built, densely packed neighborhoods. The intensity of the shaking matters, but the quality of the buildings often matters more. A strong quake under well-built towers may kill few. A moderate quake under fragile ones may kill thousands. That is why the same magnitude can produce wildly different death tolls in different places. Venezuela's tragedy was written partly in its geology, in the doublet and the fault, but also in decades of construction that left a vulnerable population living inside vulnerable walls. When the earth finally struck, those walls kept their terrible promise. This truth carries a hard kind of hope. Buildings can be strengthened. Codes can be enforced. The killer is one humans made, which means it is one humans can unmake. But that lesson comes too late for the streets already fallen, including the towers of the capital, where the wealthy and the poor alike watched their homes come apart. The earthquakes did not spare the capital. Caracas, home to around 4 million people in its greater area, felt the doublet with brutal force, and two neighborhoods in particular became symbols of the destruction: Los Palos Grandes and Altamira, leafy established districts in the southeastern part of the city, filled with high-rise apartment buildings, suddenly among the worst-hit places in the entire disaster. These were not the poorest corners of Caracas. They were solid, settled neighborhoods where tall residential towers rose over tree-lined streets. And when the ground shook, many of those towers sustained heavy damage, or collapsed outright. In parts of southeastern Caracas, nearly every high-rise took a serious hit. The skyline of whole districts was transformed in under a minute. Why did these particular neighborhoods suffer so badly? Part of the answer lies in the ground beneath them. Caracas sits in a valley, and the floor of that valley is filled with soft sediment, loose material washed down from the surrounding mountains over ages. Soft ground is dangerous during an earthquake. It can amplify the shaking, taking the energy arriving from the fault and magnifying it, like a bowl of jelly wobbling far more than the table it sits on. Tall buildings on soft ground face a special peril. Every structure has a natural rhythm, a speed at which it likes to sway. Soft valley soil tends to shake at a slow rhythm that matches the sway of tall towers. When the shaking rhythm and the building rhythm line up, they reinforce each other, and the tower swings harder and harder, like a child being pushed on a swing at just the right moment. This deadly matching can shake a high-rise apart even when shorter buildings nearby survive. For the residents of Los Palos Grandes and Altamira, the experience was a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. Towers that had stood for decades began to sway violently, then to crack, then in some cases to fail. People fled down stairwells as the building groaned around them. Those on higher floors faced the longest, most terrifying escape, racing down flight after flight as the structure heaved. Local officials quickly named these districts among the most damaged in the city. Rescue teams poured in, working the collapsed sites with the same careful, dangerous methods used on the coast, digging by hand, listening for voices, shoring up rubble to keep it from shifting. The wealthy neighbourhoods and the poor coastal towns now shared the same grim scenes. The damage to Caracas carried a message that reached far beyond Venezuela. A modern capital, a major city, watched some of its established towers come down. It showed that no city built on the wrong ground with the wrong rules is truly safe from a great earthquake. Wealth and location offered no shield when the valley soil began to amplify the shaking and the old towers began to sway. As the dust settled over Los Palos Grandes and Altamira, a new and urgent problem emerged. Thousands of buildings across the capital were still standing, but no one knew which ones were safe to enter and which might collapse in the next aftershock. Every damaged tower became a question mark, and answering those questions fast before more people died required a system as simple as it was chilling. A system of 3 colours. After a great earthquake, a second disaster hides inside the first. The buildings that did not fall, some are perfectly safe, some are secretly ruined, standing only by luck, ready to drop at the next tremor. Telling them apart quickly is a matter of life and death. In Caracas, the authorities reached for a tool as simple as a traffic light. In the hard-hit municipality of Chacao, which includes some of the worst damaged neighbourhoods, officials began moving building to building, assessing the damage and marking each structure with one of 3 colours. Green meant the building was safe to live in. Yellow meant moderate damage, enter with caution. Red meant the structure was too dangerous to occupy, stay out. The beauty of the system is its clarity. In the chaos after a disaster, when fear and rumour spread faster than facts, a single colour painted on a wall cuts through the confusion. A resident does not need to understand engineering. They need to know one thing. Can I go home tonight? Or will my home kill me if I try? Green, yellow, red answers that question at a glance. Behind each colour, though, lay difficult and dangerous work. Trained inspectors had to enter or approach damaged buildings, often while aftershocks still rattled the city, and judge whether cracked walls and strained columns could be trusted. A wrong green risks sending a family back into a death trap. A wrong red leaves people needlessly homeless when housing is desperately scarce. Every judgment carried weight. For the residents, the colours brought both answers and heartbreak. A green mark meant relief, a return to normalcy, a bed of one's own. A red mark meant exile, the loss of home, belongings sealed inside a building you could no longer enter. Imagine standing on the street, looking up at your apartment, your whole life inside it, forbidden to climb the stairs because a red mark says the next shake could bury you. A woman named Soledad Campos Aparicio stood among the displaced, holding her dog in her arms, waiting for permission to return home that was unlikely to come soon. She was one of thousands forced out, part of a wave of people suddenly with nowhere to sleep, their houses standing but sealed or fallen entirely. The traffic light system also revealed the true scale of the crisis. Collapsed buildings are obvious, but a city can have far more damaged buildings than collapsed ones, each needing inspection, each potentially unsafe. Working through them all takes time the city does not have, especially with aftershocks threatening to turn a yellow building red without warning. This is one of the quiet, brutal realities of earthquakes. The danger does not end when the shaking stops. It lingers in every cracked wall, every strained column, every structure that survived the main shock but lost its strength doing so. The colours were an attempt to map that lingering danger, to keep people out of the buildings most likely to become their tombs. Yet even as inspectors marked walls and families slept in the streets, an extraordinary thing was happening in the rubble of the fallen buildings. Against all odds, against the passing hours, people were being pulled out alive. And one of those rescues, of the smallest possible survivor, would become a symbol of a hope for a shattered nation. In the middle of so much loss, the world held its breath for a single small life. A baby, just 9 months old, trapped with their mother beneath the wreckage of a collapsed building. For 3 days they lay hidden in the rubble in the dark as rescuers dug toward them, and the odds grew longer with every passing hour. 3 days. Consider what that means for an infant, in the crushing heat and dust of a collapsed building, without reliable water, without light, in a space barely big enough to breathe. The window for finding earthquake survivors alive narrows fast. The first hours are golden. After that, thirst, injury and exposure steadily close the door. For a baby to survive 3 days beneath the concrete pushed against everything the odds predicted. Then, against those odds, the rescuers broke through. They reached the mother and the child, and both were alive. Search teams working the site lifted the 9-month-old from the rubble, and the moment rippled outward across a grieving country and around the world. In the middle of a disaster measured in thousands of deaths, here was one life pulled back from the edge. Rescues like this are why teams keep digging long after hope seems lost. Every collapsed building might hold a pocket of survival, a gap where a survivor clings on, waiting. The searchers cannot know which pile of rubble hides a living person and which holds only silence. So they work every site as if a life depends on it, because sometimes one does. The baby was not the only miracle in those desperate days. A 57-year-old man named Luis Escalona was trapped under the rubble of his apartment building. His family knew he was alive because he had managed to reach a sibling, a thread of contact through the concrete. For 2 days they held on to that thread, and after 2 days rescuers pulled him free. These stories share a common thread of their own: communication. Luis lived in part because his family knew he was down there and knew he was alive, which kept the search focused and urgent. The ability to reach the outside world, even a single message, can be the difference between a rescue and a body never found. In a disaster, information is a form of survival. That truth casts a dark shadow over what was happening across Venezuela in those same hours. Because at the very moment when communication meant life, when families needed every possible way to find each other, the country was one of the hardest places on earth to get information in or out. The digital world that survivors and relatives depended on was being squeezed shut. The rescue of a baby and a trapped man showed what was possible when word got through. The larger story of the disaster showed what happened when it did not. Somewhere in the rubble were people whose families never got the message, never knew where to dig, never got the chance that the Escalona family got. The number of those people would climb into the tens of thousands. To understand how a modern country could lose track of so many, we have to look at the strange, dark information landscape that survivors faced, a blackout that went far beyond the failure of the power grid. As the days passed, one number grew more haunting than any other. Not the confirmed dead, terrible as that count was, the missing. In the aftermath of the doublet, tens of thousands of people were unaccounted for, their fates unknown, their families searching, waiting, refusing to give up hope. Missing is one of the most agonizing words in any disaster. The dead can be mourned, the living can be found, the missing exist in a cruel space between, neither confirmed lost nor confirmed safe. For every missing person, a family lives in suspended dread, checking hospitals, walking the streets, staring at collapsed buildings and wondering if their loved one lies inside. Why did the number climb so high? Part of the answer is the sheer scale of collapse. When buildings pancake and whole neighborhoods fall, people are buried in places rescuers cannot quickly reach, until every site is dug out, and that can take weeks. The buried remain officially missing. The rubble holds its secrets until it is cleared, slab by dangerous slab. Another part is displacement. When an earthquake destroys homes and roads, it scatters people. Families flee to relatives, to shelters, to open ground, to other towns. In the chaos, a person who fled to a cousin's house in another state might be listed missing by relatives who cannot reach them. Some of the missing are, in truth, alive and safe but simply out of contact, cut off by broken phones and blocked networks. That distinction matters enormously, and it points to the deepest problem. In a functioning information environment, many of the missing would quickly resolve. A phone call, a message, a social media post saying I am alive would move a name from the missing list to the safe list within hours. The missing count would shrink as fast as it grew, but Venezuela in June was not a functioning information environment, and that turned a temporary uncertainty into a prolonged nightmare. The affected region was vast and crowded. The United Nations Children's Agency warned that around 3.9 million children lived in the areas struck by the quakes. Millions of families, packed into the northern belt of the country, all suddenly trying to account for one another at once, through damaged networks, in the dark. The scale of the search was almost beyond imagining. For rescue officials, the tens of thousands missing represented an unbearable pressure. Each name might be a life still savable in the rubble, or a person safe elsewhere, or a death not yet confirmed. Sorting the three, with limited communication and blocked information, consumed enormous effort. Every hour spent chasing someone already safe was an hour not spent digging for someone still trapped. And beneath the official count lay the private agony of countless families. People like the man digging for his mother and brother, clinging to the hope that missing might still mean alive. In disaster after disaster, it is this waiting, this not knowing, that families later describe as the hardest part of all. The dead can be buried. The missing cannot even be grieved. The vast number of missing was made far worse by a choice that had nothing to do with the earthquake itself. As the country struggled to account for its people, the flow of information was being deliberately choked off, and that blackout would shape the entire response to the disaster. In the hours after the doublet, the first report spoke of dozens dead. Then the number moved. It did not stop moving for weeks. Watching the death toll climb day after day became its own kind of horror, a running count of a tragedy that kept getting worse. In the very first hours, officials confirmed only a handful of deaths, a few collapsed structures, early and incomplete. Within a day, the count passed 160. Then it climbed past 900, then beyond 1,400, then past 1,700. And it kept rising from there, week after week, as rescuers reached deeper into the rubble and remote areas finally reported in. In time, the confirmed toll climbed into the thousands, past 5,000 lives lost, with more than 16,000 injured. Why does the number climb like this, instead of being known at once? The answer reveals how a disaster of this scale actually unfolds. In the first hours, no one has the full picture. Communication is down, roads are blocked, whole districts are dark and cut off. Officials can only count what they can reach, and at first they can reach very little. As hours become days, rescuers push into more sites. Blocked roads get cleared, isolated towns finally make contact. Each new area reveals new casualties that were always there but had gone uncounted. So the number grows, not because more people are dying, but because more of the truth is being uncovered. The rising count is the sound of the full scale slowly coming into focus. There is a darker driver too. In the days after a collapse, some of the injured die of their wounds, and some of the trapped die before rescuers can reach them. The disaster keeps taking lives even after the shaking has stopped. Every hour a person spends buried, every delay in medical care adds to the toll. The clock itself becomes an enemy. Scientists at the United States Geological Survey use a rapid forecasting tool to estimate likely casualties within minutes of a major quake, based on its size, depth, and the population above it. For Venezuela, that tool flagged the grim possibility that the death toll could climb very high, potentially into the many thousands. It was an early warning that the confirmed count, still small at that point, was destined to grow far larger. For the families waiting, each update was a fresh wound. A rising toll meant the odds of a missing loved one being among the dead grew with every announcement, and the media environment made the uncertainty worse, leaving many unable to get reliable numbers at all, forced to guess at the fate of their own relatives. The climbing toll also told a story about vulnerability. A magnitude 7.5 earthquake is enormous, but similar quakes in well-prepared regions have killed far fewer. The scale of death in Venezuela reflected the doublet, the shallow depth, the crowded coast, and above all the fragile buildings. The number climbed so high because so much was stacked against the people in its path. Behind every increment of that rising number was a person, a name, a family. The count is a statistic, but it is built from individual lives, each one lost in a home that should have kept them safe. And the country's ability to even record and share those losses was being crippled by a blackout unlike almost any other in the world. When an earthquake strikes, it knocks out power. That is expected. Lines snap, stations fail, and neighborhoods go dark until crews restore the grid. But Venezuela faced a second kind of blackout, one that had nothing to do with fallen power lines, and it made the disaster far harder to survive. Even before the earthquake, Venezuela had one of the most restricted information environments in the world. According to monitoring groups, more than 200 websites in the country were blocked, including local and international news outlets, social media platforms, and even the tools people use to get around such blocks. The digital doors were already shut. Then the earth started shaking behind them. Think about what information means in a disaster. It means a survivor sending a message that they are alive. It means a family learning which hospital took their injured father. It means people finding out which roads are open, which shelters have space where aid is arriving. It means the outside world seeing the scale of the crisis and responding. In a modern emergency, the free flow of information is as vital as water and medicine. In Venezuela, that flow was choked. With social media platforms and news sites blocked, and with the tools to bypass the blocks also cut off, people struggled to reach each other in the world. Relatives abroad, desperate for word of loved ones, hit walls of silence. Survivors trying to call for help found their usual channels closed. The blackout turned an already terrible situation into an information void. The United Nations pressed the authorities to restore access, warning that in the hours and days after such a disaster, timely access to reliable information would be vital for protecting lives. A body investigating conditions in the country urged that social networks and media outlets be fully reopened. Eventually, access to one major platform was partly restored, a small opening in the wall. But the damage from an information blackout is hard to undo. In the critical early window when rescues are most likely and coordination most needed, silence costs lives. Every message that cannot be sent is a survivor who cannot be found. Every blocked news report is a family left guessing. The blackout did not shake a single building, yet it may have shaped the fate of thousands. The information void also warped the world's understanding of the disaster. When a country goes dark, outsiders struggle to grasp how bad things truly are. Aid decisions, media coverage, and international response all depend on knowing the scale, and the scale was hidden behind blocked sites and broken networks. A disaster half seen is a disaster half answered. This layered blackout, the physical failure of the power grid stacked on top of a deliberate restriction of the digital world, created a uniquely cruel situation. The people of Venezuela faced one of the largest earthquakes in their history, while cut off from the very tools that could have helped them survive it, and helped the world help them. Behind the statistics and the blocked websites stood the most vulnerable victims of all. Not the buildings, not the networks, but the youngest members of a shaken society. And their numbers, in the disaster zone, reached into the millions. Amid every earthquake statistic, one figure stands apart for its sheer weight. The United Nations Children's Agency warned that around 3.9 million children lived in the areas struck by the Venezuela earthquakes. Nearly 4 million young lives inside the zone of destruction, suddenly facing a crisis they could not understand and did not cause. Children are among the most vulnerable people in any disaster, and for reasons that go beyond their size. They depend entirely on the adults and systems around them, and an earthquake shatters exactly those systems. Homes fall, schools close or collapse, hospitals overflow, parents are killed, injured, or separated. The web of care that keeps a child safe can be torn apart in seconds. Picture the immediate dangers: a child trapped in rubble, too small to free themselves, too young even to call out clearly for help. A child pulled from a collapse, injured and terrified, needing medical care in a hospital system already pushed to breaking. A child suddenly separated from parents in the chaos, wandering a shattered neighborhood, or waiting in a shelter for a mother or father who may never come. Then come the dangers that unfold more slowly. With so many families displaced and homes destroyed, children faced the threat of going without clean water, without enough food, without safe shelter. Aid groups warned that the country's healthcare system was being pushed toward its limit, and when a health system strains, the youngest and the sick suffer first. Diseases spread more easily in crowded shelters, injuries go untreated, malnutrition creeps in, the information blackout struck children with special cruelty. Separated families rely on communication to reunite, and when the networks are down and the platforms are blocked, a lost child stays lost longer. Every hour a young child spends separated and unaccounted for is an hour of danger and fear, for them and for the parents searching frantically through a country gone dark. There is also a wound that does not show on any medical chart: the fear. A child who has felt the ground turn violent, who has watched their home come apart, who has seen adults panic and cry, carries that terror long after the rubble is cleared. The emotional scars of a great disaster can shadow a young life for years, shaping sleep, trust, and a basic sense that the world is safe. Nearly 4 million children in the danger zone means nearly 4 million families with a child to protect in the middle of catastrophe. It means schools that must somehow reopen, medical care that must somehow reach the smallest patients, and shelters that must somehow keep the younger safe. It is a humanitarian challenge layered on top of the search for survivors, stretching an already overwhelmed response even thinner. This is why organisations focused on children raised the alarm so loudly and so early. They understood that behind the collapsed towers and the climbing death toll lay a generation of young people whose needs would outlast the headlines. The rescue phase would end. The rebuilding would take years, and through all of it, those millions of children would be trying to recover in a country facing enormous strain. Reaching those children and everyone else meant getting aid into the country. But the earthquake had struck a crippling blow to the very gateway through which help and rescue and connection all had to flow. The nation's main airport had gone down. Every country has arteries through which people and supplies flow, and in a modern nation, few are more vital than the main international airport. For Venezuela, that gateway is Simón Bolívar International Airport, sitting near the coast that took the disaster's hardest blow. When the doublet struck, the airport itself sustained damage severe enough to halt its flights. An airport is easy to overlook until the moment you need it most. In a great disaster, it becomes the lifeline of the entire response. Rescue teams fly in through it. Medical supplies, food, water, and equipment arrive through it. The injured can be flown out through it. Relief workers, international aid, and the machinery of recovery all funnel through those runways and terminals. Shut it down, and you choke the flow of help at its source. That is exactly what the earthquake threatened to do. With damage significant enough to cancel departing and arriving flights, the country's principal air gateway was suddenly compromised at the precise moment its capacity mattered most. The disaster had struck not only homes and lives, but the very door through which salvation needed to come. The location made it worse. The airport sits on that same vulnerable coastal strip near La Guaira, the region where roughly 80 of every 100 buildings fell. So the gateway went down in the same blow that devastated the surrounding area, a double loss. The place that most needed rescue was also the place where the rescue infrastructure had been hit. Consider the ripple effects. Aid from abroad, ready to help, needs somewhere to land. Search and rescue teams with specialized equipment need to arrive fast because the window for finding survivors closes within days. Every hour the main airport stays compromised is an hour of delay in a race where hours mean lives. A damaged airport does not just inconvenience travelers, it slows the entire machinery of survival. Disaster responders plan for this. They look for alternate airports, military airfields, ports, and roads to move people and supplies when a primary gateway fails. Forces in the region moved to support relief efforts, and equipment was ready to reach the disaster zone by whatever routes remained open. But every workaround adds friction, distance, and time is the one thing a trapped survivor does not have. The airport damage also carried a symbolic weight. It showed how thoroughly the doublet had struck at the country's ability to function. This was a blow to homes, to the power grid, to communication networks, and now to the transport gateway all at once. A disaster that hits many systems together is far harder to recover from than one that hits a single system, because each broken piece makes fixing the others harder. The compromised gateway became one more obstacle in a response already fighting the information blackout, the scale of collapse, and the relentless aftershocks. Getting help to the people who needed it meant overcoming not just the destruction on the ground, but the crippling of the very channels through which help arrives. And even as responders battled these obstacles, the mountains looming over the coast held a further danger. The same violent shaking that toppled the buildings had loosened the slopes themselves, threatening to send them crashing down onto whatever remained below. The earthquakes did more than shake buildings. They shook the mountains. All along northern Venezuela, steep green slopes rise close to the crowded coast and the cities, and when the ground convulsed, those slopes became a danger of their own. The shaking loosened the earth itself, threatening landslides across the region. A landslide is one of the earthquake's cruelest secondary weapons. When violent shaking hits a steep hillside, it can break the grip that holds soil, rock, and debris in place. Suddenly, tons of material that clung to the slope for centuries let go all at once, sliding, tumbling, and roaring downhill with terrible speed. Anything in the path, homes, roads, people, can be buried in moments. Scientists at the United States Geological Survey, using a tool that estimates ground failure after major quakes, assessed that landslides triggered by the Venezuela earthquakes would likely be significant in number and spread across a wide area. In other words, the shaking had primed the mountains to fail, seeding the slopes with the threat of collapse across the northern belt of the country. The danger of earthquake landslides goes beyond the initial slides. They can block roads, exactly the roads that rescuers need to reach trapped survivors, and that supplies need to travel. A single major landslide across a mountain highway can cut off an entire community, leaving it isolated and unreachable at the moment it most needs help. In a country already struggling with a damaged airport and blocked communications, blocked roads were one more knot in the tangle. This region knows the horror of what water and earth can do when they rush down these mountains. Years before, catastrophic torrents of mud and rock came down these same slopes and buried coastal communities, one of the worst natural disasters in the country's history. The people of the coast carry that memory. To face the threat of the mountains failing again, this time shaken loose by earthquakes, struck at a deep and specific fear. Landslides also complicate the picture of who is missing and who can be found. A person buried by a slide in a remote area may go unrecorded for a long time, their fate hidden under tons of earth in a place no rescuer has yet reached. The mountains can swallow evidence of the disaster, adding to the uncertainty that already haunted the missing count. For the scientists monitoring the aftermath, the landslide threat was not a one-time event but a lingering hazard. Slopes weakened by the main shocks can fail later, especially when aftershocks rattle them again or when rain soaks the loosened ground. Every tremor that followed the doublet risked shaking more earth loose. The mountains stayed dangerous long after the main quakes had passed. This is the layered nature of a great earthquake. The first shock topples buildings. The mountains it loosens threaten to bury more. The roads those slides block choke off rescue. Each hazard feeds the next, weaving a web of danger that spreads far beyond the initial shaking. A single doublet became a cascade of threats rolling across the land. And the ground was still not finished. In the days and weeks after the twin quakes, the earth beneath Venezuela kept moving again and again and again, in a relentless drumbeat of aftershocks that would number in the thousands. The great quakes were over in seconds. The shaking was not. In the days and weeks that followed, the ground beneath Venezuela refused to settle, trembling again and again in a long series of aftershocks. By one count from the country's seismological foundation, more than 1,100 earthquakes struck in just the first roughly 2 weeks after the doublet. Stop and absorb that. More than 1,100 earthquakes in 14 days. That is dozens upon dozens of tremors every single day, a near constant rumble beneath a population already traumatized. Most were small, felt as a shiver or not at all, but their sheer number kept the region in a state of perpetual unease, the ground never truly still, the nightmare never fully ending. Aftershocks are the Earth's way of settling into its new shape. When a great earthquake ruptures a fault, it does not release all the stress in one clean motion. The rock around the rupture is left disturbed, jostled into a new arrangement that is still finding its balance. As it settles, it slips in countless small adjustments, each one a tiny earthquake, each one an aftershock. They are the aftermath of the main shock playing out over time. The pattern of aftershocks follows a rough rule that scientists know well. They are most frequent and largest right after the main shock, then gradually decrease in number and strength over the following days, weeks, and months. But gradually is the key word. The decline is slow and uneven. A region can rumble with aftershocks for a very long time before the ground truly quiets down. For the people of Venezuela, the aftershocks were a special kind of torment. Every tremor reawakened the terror of the main event. Every shiver of the ground asked a dreadful question. Is this just another aftershock, or is this the start of a new great quake? Living through that uncertainty day after day, night after night, wears at the mind in ways the initial disaster never could. The aftershocks also carried real physical danger, and it centered on the wounded buildings. Structures that survived the doublet did so by using up their strength, leaving them cracked and weakened. An aftershock that would be harmless to a healthy building can be enough to finish off a damaged one. So each tremor threatened to turn a yellow-marked building red, or to collapse what the main shocks had only cracked. This is why aftershocks make rescue and recovery so dangerous. Searchers working in the rubble of collapsed buildings, or inspecting the damaged ones still standing, do their work knowing the ground could lurch again at any moment, bringing down more concrete on top of them. Every aftershock is a risk to the very people trying to save lives and assess the damage. The scale of the aftershock sequence, more than 1,000 tremors in 2 weeks, told scientists something important about what had happened underground. It reflected a large, complex rupture across a tangled zone of faults, a system so disturbed that it needed thousands of adjustments to find a new balance. The doublet had not simply broken 2 faults, it had unsettled a whole region of the crust, and where those aftershocks clustered most densely, revealed something that made scientists deeply uneasy. The strongest concentration of tremors was creeping toward the one place Venezuela could least afford it, directly beneath its capital. When scientists mapped the swarm of aftershocks rippling out from the doublet, they noticed something that made them pay very close attention. The tremors were not scattered evenly, they clustered. And one of the densest, most active clusters sat at the eastern end of the rupture zone, edging toward the capital, toward Caracas and its 4 million people. To read the pattern, researchers plotted every aftershock on a map, then projected them onto a timeline to watch how the sequence unfolded over the days. The picture that emerged showed the aftershocks concentrated in particular zones, rather than spread across the whole region, and the eastern tip of the activity, the end nearest Caracas, showed especially strong persistent seismicity. Why does this matter so much? Because the location of aftershocks traces where the crust is still adjusting, still slipping, still working out the new balance of stress after the main shocks. A dense cluster of aftershocks marks a part of the fault system that is actively moving, and a densely active zone creeping toward a crowded capital is exactly the kind of thing that keeps seismologists awake at night. Within just 2 hours of the main shock, 6 aftershocks were felt in Caracas itself. The capital, already reeling from the damage to its towers, felt the ground shudder again and again while its residents were still fleeing into the streets. For a city where so many buildings were already cracked and weakened, each new tremor was a fresh threat to whatever still stood. The concern is layered. Caracas sits in that valley of soft sediment that amplifies shaking, filled with older buildings, some now damaged and fragile. Persistent aftershock activity nearby means repeated jolts to a city uniquely poorly placed to absorb them. Even moderate aftershocks, harmless in a robust city on solid ground, could finish weakened buildings in a soft-soiled valley full of wounded structures. Scientists watching the sequence had a specific worry beyond the aftershocks themselves. When one part of a fault system ruptures, it can load the neighbouring sections, pushing them closer to their own failure. If the doublet had shifted stress onto the segment closest to Caracas, then the intense aftershock activity there might be a sign of a section under growing strain. The capital could be sitting near a part of the fault that the June quakes had nudged toward its edge. This is the shadow that hangs over Caracas today. The main shocks did their damage and passed, but they left the crust beneath the capital disturbed and active, still slipping in a steady drumbeat of tremors. The immediate danger of building collapse from aftershocks was real, and the longer-term question of whether the June events had raised the risk to the capital was, and remains, deeply serious. For the millions living in Caracas, this created a grim new reality. The great quake struck 100 miles to the west, yet the capital could not simply exhale and move on. The activity had crept to its doorstep. Every tremor felt in the city was a reminder that the ground beneath them was still restless, still settling, and possibly still dangerous in ways not yet fully understood. That uncertainty led scientists to do something they take very seriously after any great earthquake. They issued a forecast, a careful, sobering estimate of what the ground was likely to do next, and the numbers in that forecast made clear the danger was far from over. After a great earthquake, scientists do something that sounds almost impossible. They forecast the future of the ground, not with certainty, because no one can predict the exact moment of the next quake, but with probabilities, careful estimates of how likely further shaking is in the days ahead. For Venezuela, the forecast that followed the doublet was sobering. Experts assessed the chances of significant aftershocks in the week after the main shocks. Their estimate for a magnitude 5 or larger aftershock was that it was nearly certain to happen. A magnitude 5 earthquake is a serious event on its own, capable of causing real damage, and forecasters judged it almost a given that at least one would strike in the days after the doublet. More alarming was the estimate for a larger aftershock. Forecasters put the probability of a magnitude 6 or greater event in that first week at somewhere around 40 to 50%, a roughly 1 in 2 chance of another major earthquake, on top of everything that had already happened, striking a region already in ruins. Those are frightening odds when you are living in a cracked building above a restless fault. To understand why these forecasts matter, think about what they mean for a damaged region. Buildings that barely survived the doublet, marked yellow, standing on borrowed strength, might not survive a strong aftershock. A magnitude 6 striking a landscape of wounded structures could bring down buildings that the main shocks had only cracked, adding new casualties to a toll already climbing. The forecast was a warning that the disaster could still get worse. Scientists build these forecasts from decades of studying how earthquakes behave. Aftershock sequences follow patterns regular enough to estimate. Right after a main shock, the chance of a large aftershock is elevated, then it decays over time. By feeding the size of the main shocks and the early aftershock activity into these well-tested models, forecasters can put real numbers on the risk, numbers that guide how rescuers work and how residents protect themselves. The forecast shape decisions on the ground. If a strong aftershock is nearly certain, then keeping people out of damaged buildings becomes even more urgent. The traffic light inspections, the reluctance to let residents return home, the caution of rescue teams, all of it made more sense in light of a forecast that said more shaking was coming. The science of prediction fed directly into the science of survival. There is a hard honesty in these forecasts. Scientists cannot say when the next quake will strike, or exactly how big it will be. What they can say is how likely various outcomes are, and they share those odds openly, even when the odds are grim. It is a way of arming people with the truth, so they can make better choices about where to sleep, whether to enter a building, how much caution to keep. For Venezuela, the forecast delivered a clear message. The ground was still dangerous. The near-certain moderate aftershock and the roughly even chance of a major one meant the crisis was ongoing, the threat still live. A country desperate to begin recovery had to keep bracing for more. And that ongoing danger raised a haunting question about the past, because this was not the first time in recent memory that Venezuela's ground had struck with a rare double blow. Less than a year earlier, a warning had come, and it went largely unheeded. Here is a detail that turns the whole story colder. The June doublet was not the first time in recent memory that Venezuela's earth had struck twice in quick succession. Less than a year before, in the autumn of the previous year, a similar double earthquake had rattled the western state of Zulia. A smaller warning, arriving before the catastrophe. The Zulia event was less severe than the June disaster, but it shared the same rare and telling character. 2 earthquakes striking close together, a doublet in miniature. It caused significant property damage and was linked to at least 1 death. In the moment, it might have seemed like an unusual but manageable event, a strange episode in a corner of the country. In hindsight, it reads like a rehearsal. Why does the Zulia doublet matter so much? Because it showed that this rare pattern, 2 quakes firing close together, was possible in Venezuela and had happened recently. The country's tangled boundary zone, with its bundle of interconnected faults, was capable of producing doublets. The ground had demonstrated the very behaviour that would later devastate the north. The warning was written in the record for anyone paying attention. This is one of the quiet tragedies of earthquake risk. The signs are often there, scattered through history and recent events, hinting at what the ground can do. A doublet in Zulia, a long record of great quakes along the northern faults, a fault system known to be active and dangerous. All the ingredients of catastrophe were visible on the map and in the record. What was missing was the will and the means to act on them before the disaster arrived. Preparing for earthquakes is uniquely hard precisely because of their timing. A fault might stay quiet for a century, then unleash devastation in a minute. Between the great quakes, the danger fades from memory. People build, grow, and forget. A warning like the Zulia doublet is easy to dismiss when the ground has been calm for generations, and the pressures of daily life crowd out distant risks. Yet the professionals knew. Seismologists understood the northern fault system was capable of a great earthquake. They knew doublets could occur, having just watched one in Zulia. They knew the coast and the capital were crowded with vulnerable buildings on dangerous ground. The knowledge existed. The gap lay between knowing the risk and acting to reduce it, a gap that exists in the earthquake-prone regions all over the world. The Zulia warning also teaches a broader lesson about how nature communicates danger. It rarely sends a single clear alarm. Instead, it drops hints, smaller events, patterns in the record that only make full sense after the big one arrives. Reading those hints in advance and acting on them is one of the great challenges of living on a restless planet. Had the Zulia doublet been treated as the warning it now appears to be, perhaps more could have been done, more buildings strengthened, more plans made. But warnings are only useful when they are heeded, and the pressures against action are always strong. The June disaster stands as a brutal reminder of the cost of a warning missed. Venezuela's history holds even older and darker warnings than Zulia, though. To grasp the full weight of what the northern faults can do, we have to travel back more than 2 centuries, to a day when this same ground killed on a scale almost beyond imagining. To understand the true power of the faults beneath Venezuela, we have to travel back more than 200 years, to one of the deadliest days in the country's history. In the year 1812, a massive earthquake struck Caracas, and the devastation it caused still ranks among the greatest catastrophes the region has ever known. The 1812 earthquake is estimated to have reached a magnitude around 7.7, a monster comparable in raw power to the June doublet. It devastated Caracas and other cities, and the death toll was staggering. As many as 30,000 people are thought to have died. In an era of far smaller populations, that number represented a shattering blow, wiping out a huge portion of the city in a single afternoon. The timing made it even more consequential. The quake struck during the Venezuelan War of Independence, a moment of enormous political upheaval as the country fought to free itself from colonial rule. The disaster fell hardest on areas that supported the independence movement, and it became entangled with the struggle for the nation's future. Nature and history collided, and the earthquake left a mark on the very birth of the country. For our story, the 1812 catastrophe carries a crucial lesson. It proves that the faults beneath northern Venezuela are capable of producing truly enormous city-destroying earthquakes, and that they have done so within recorded history. The June doublet was not a freak event without precedent. It was the latest chapter in a long, violent story that stretches back centuries along the same dangerous ground. The people of Caracas have lived in the shadow of 1812 ever since, at least in memory and record, if not always in daily awareness. The knowledge that their city had once been destroyed by an earthquake was part of the historical backdrop of the place. And yet, as generations passed and the ground stayed relatively calm, that knowledge faded into the distance. A story from long ago rather than a live and present danger. This fading of memory is one of the deepest challenges in earthquake safety. When a great quake strikes, the survivors carry vivid fear and often rebuild with care. But that fear does not pass fully to their children and grandchildren. As the decades stretch on without another great quake, the sense of danger dims. Cities expand, often with less caution than the memory of catastrophe would demand. The lesson of 1812 grew faint, precisely because the ground gave Caracas so many quiet years. The comparison between 1812 and the June doublet is striking and sobering. 2 great earthquakes, more than 2 centuries apart, both striking the crowded heart of the country, both capable of mass casualties. The The faults had not changed their nature. They had simply waited, as they always do, storing their energy across generations until the moment came to release it once more. 1812 was the deadliest of Venezuela's historical earthquakes, but it was not the only great one. The northern faults have struck again and again across the centuries, and one event in particular marked the last time the ground shook with the kind of power seen in June. To find it, we move forward from 1812 to the dawn of the 20th century. Seismologists studying the June doublet reached for a comparison, and the one they landed on was more than a century old. The last time Venezuela's ground shook with this kind of power was in the year 1900, when a great earthquake of magnitude around 7.7 struck the region. Not since then had the country felt anything as strong as the June twin quakes. Think about the span of time that comparison represents. More than 120 years separated the two events. Generations were born, lived, and died in between. The country transformed from the world of the year 1900 to the modern nation of today. Through all of that change, the ground stayed below its greatest power until June brought it roaring back. The 1900 earthquake struck along the same dangerous plate boundary that produced the June disaster. Scientists studying the region have linked that historic quake to a rupture on the eastern part of the San Sebastian Fault, part of the same tangled system running across the north of the country. The June doublet and the 1900 quake were, in a sense, distant relatives, born of the same restless border between the Caribbean and South American plates. This long gap between great earthquakes reveals something fundamental about how these faults work. They operate on a timescale far longer than a human life. A fault can spend a century or more slowly loading with stress, quiet and seemingly harmless, before it finally releases in a single catastrophic rupture. The calm between the great quakes is not safety. It is the fault winding tighter, storing the energy for the next release. For the people living along the northern faults, this slow rhythm is deeply dangerous, precisely because it lulls. When more than a century passes without a great quake, the danger fades from living memory. No one alive remembers the last one. The stories grow distant. The daily concerns of life crowd out a threat that seems to belong to the history books. And so, cities grow and buildings rise with a great quake treated as a thing of the past. Then the fault, keeping its own long calendar, reaches its limit. All the energy stored across the quiet decades releases at once, and a population that had forgotten the danger is caught unprepared. The very length of the calm between quakes is part of what makes them so deadly when they finally come. The June doublet ended a quiet that had lasted longer than anyone living could remember. Scientists know this pattern well, and it is why they study the historical record so carefully. By piecing together the great quakes of the past, from 1812 to 1900 and beyond, they build a picture of how often the northern faults produce major earthquakes and how much energy they can unleash. That history is a warning written across centuries, telling anyone who reads it that this ground will strike again. The comparison to 1900 placed the June doublet in its proper frightening context. This was the strongest shaking in well over a century, a once-in-many-generations event, striking a country that had grown vast and crowded during the long calm. And it forces a question about the future. If these great quakes come roughly once a century or so, what does that mean for the years and decades ahead? To answer, we have to understand why the fault stores its energy for so long. Why do the great earthquakes come so rarely, separated by a century or more, only to strike with such devastating force when they finally arrive? The answer lies in the slow, patient way these faults store their energy, hoarding power across generations before releasing it in a single, violent moment. Return to the image of the plates grinding past each other at the speed your fingernails grow. That motion never stops. Every year, the Caribbean and South American plates shift a fraction of an inch along their boundary. But along the locked sections of the fault, that motion cannot happen freely. The rock is jammed, held by friction, refusing to slip. So the pressure of the plate motion builds behind the jam year after year, decade after decade. Picture bending that wooden ruler again slowly, steadily. For a long time it holds. The strain builds silently inside it. From the outside, nothing seems to be happening. Then, in an instant, it snaps, releasing all the stored energy at once. The longer you bend it before the break, the more violent the snap. A fault works the same way. The longer it stays locked, the more energy it stores, and the bigger the eventual earthquake. This is why the gap between great quakes matters so much. A fault that ruptures often, releasing its stress in frequent smaller quakes, never builds up to the truly catastrophic level, but a fault that stays locked for a century or more accumulates an enormous store of energy. When it finally lets go, it produces a great earthquake, precisely because it waited so long. The calm and the catastrophe are two sides of the same coin. The northern Venezuelan faults appear to follow this slow, dangerous rhythm. Their great quakes come generations apart in 1812, in 1900, and now in June, each one the release of energy stored across the quiet decades between. The very rarity of these events is a measure of how much power each one contains. Rare and enormous go together. There is a further twist that makes the timing so hard to predict. Faults do not keep a perfect schedule. The build-up of stress is steady, but the exact moment the rock gives way depends on countless details: the strength of the rock, the roughness of the fault, the influence of nearby quakes. So scientists can say a fault is capable of a great quake, and even estimate roughly how often, but they cannot mark a date on the calendar. The uncertainty is built into the physics. This is the maddening reality of living on a major fault. You can know with confidence that a great earthquake will come. You can know roughly how powerful it might be. What you cannot know is the day, the year, or even the decade. The fault hoards its power on its own schedule, indifferent to the cities and lives above it, releasing that power whenever the rock finally reaches its limit. For Venezuela, the June doublet was the fault cashing in more than a century of stored energy. And that raises the vital question at the heart of what comes next. How much energy is left? Did the doublet release all the pressure that had built up, or only some of it? To begin answering that, scientists turned to a remarkable tool that let them measure the ground's wounds from space. To understand what the earthquakes did to the ground, scientists looked down from orbit. Using satellites circling high above the Earth, researchers can measure how the surface of the planet shifts during a great quake, tracing the exact shape of the rupture with astonishing precision. It is one of the most powerful tools in modern earthquake science, and it let them read Venezuela's wound from space. The technique works by comparing images of the ground taken before and after the earthquake. Satellites capture the surface in fine detail, and by tracking how features moved between the two images, scientists can map the deformation, the way the land was pushed, pulled, and shifted by the rupture below. Ground that lurched several feet in one direction shows up clearly when the before and after are compared. This satellite view revealed the anatomy of the disaster. It showed where the fault slipped and by how much, mapping the rupture across the tangled boundary zone. And it filled in gaps that ground-based instruments alone could not cover, especially in the eastern part of the region near Caracas, where the fault runs partly offshore and land instruments have a harder time measuring the motion. That eastern deformation proved especially important and especially concerning. The satellite measurements, combined with the dense aftershock activity, revealed intense deformation to the east near the capital. The ground there had shifted significantly, a sign of how much energy the rupture had released in that direction toward the millions of people in Caracas. Reading the wound from space helped scientists see just how close the disaster's forces had reached to the capital. The satellite data also helped answer a critical question. Where did the fault rupture, and where did it not? A great earthquake does not always break the entire fault. It ruptures a section, releasing the stress there while leaving other sections still locked and loaded. Mapping exactly which parts broke tells scientists which parts did not, and those unbroken sections are where the danger of a future quake concentrates. This is why the view from space matters so much for what comes next. By showing the precise extent of the rupture, satellite measurements help scientists identify the neighbouring sections of fault that the June quakes may have left loaded and strained. If a locked section sits right next to the part that ruptured, it may now carry extra stress, pushed closer to its own failure. The wound, read carefully, hints at where the next one might open. There is something almost miraculous about this capability. From hundreds of miles above the Earth, scientists can measure ground movements of just inches, tracing the invisible work of forces buried miles underground. It transforms earthquake science from guesswork into measurement, letting researchers see the shape of a disaster that no human eye on the ground could ever perceive whole. For Venezuela, the space-based measurements became a vital part of understanding both what had happened and what might come. They mapped the rupture, revealed the intense deformation reaching toward Caracas, and helped frame the crucial question of stress transfer. That question, whether the June doublet had loaded a neighbouring fault, is perhaps the most important one hanging over the country's future, and it deserves a closer look. We saw how the first quake triggered the second in under 40 seconds, through the transfer of stress from one fault to its neighbour. Now comes the question that haunts every scientist studying the aftermath. When the second, larger quake ruptured, did it in turn transfer stress onto yet another fault, arming the next earthquake somewhere down the line? The principle is the same one that produced the doublet, only playing out on a longer timescale. When a fault ruptures, it redistributes the stress it was carrying onto the surrounding rock. Some neighbouring faults get relieved of stress, pushed further from failure. Others get loaded, pushed closer to it. Whether a nearby fault becomes safer or more dangerous depends on its position and orientation relative to the rupture. For Venezuela, this question carries enormous weight because of geography. The rupture zone stretches toward the capital, and the eastern sections of the fault system lie nearest to Caracas and its millions of people. If the June doublet loaded those eastern sections, then the very part of the fault closest to the capital may now be under increased strain, nudged toward a future rupture. Scientists look for clues to answer this. The dense cluster of aftershocks at the eastern end near Caracas is one such clue. Intense aftershock activity in a particular zone can indicate a section of crust under stress, actively adjusting. Combined with the satellite measurements of deformation reaching toward the capital, the picture suggests the eastern fault sections experienced real forces from the June events. Whether those forces raise the risk of a future quake, there is a question researchers are working hard to understand. The historical record adds another layer to the concern. That eastern part of the system, along the San Sebastian Fault, was linked to the Great Earthquake of 1900. It is a section capable of producing a major quake, and it sits close to the capital. If the June doublet transferred stress onto or near that section, it would be loading a fault with a proven history of destruction in the worst possible location. None of this means another great quake is certain or imminent. Stress transfer changes probabilities, not certainties. A loaded fault may rupture soon, or it may hold for decades or longer before it finally fails. What stress transfer does is shift the odds, and after a great earthquake, scientists watch the neighbouring faults closely precisely because those odds may have moved in a dangerous direction. This is the deepest reason the June doublet remains a live and unfinished story. The quakes themselves are over, but their influence on the surrounding faults endures. The stored stress they redistributed is still out there, sitting on neighbouring sections of crust, part of the ongoing calculation of where and when the ground might strike again. The disaster reshaped the pressure map beneath the entire region. For a capital city of 4 million, on soft soil, filled with vulnerable buildings, the possibility that the June quakes loaded a nearby fault is a sobering one. It transforms the disaster from a single event into a potential prelude, a reminder that the pressure beneath the region did not vanish when the shaking stopped. And it brings the danger squarely home to the place with the most to lose, Caracas itself. Every strand of this story eventually leads back to one place, Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, home to around 4 million people in its greater area, and a city that sits at the crossroads of nearly every danger we have discussed. To understand what comes next for the country, you have to understand the unique and troubling situation of its capital. Start with the ground itself. Caracas lies in a valley, and that valley is filled with soft sediment washed down from the surrounding mountains over ages. We saw how soft ground amplifies earthquake shaking, taking the energy arriving from the fault and magnifying it. A quake that would be moderate on solid rock can become severe in a soft valley. Caracas is built on exactly the kind of ground that turns earthquakes deadlier. Now, at the buildings. The city grew rapidly through the middle of the last century, throwing up homes and towers at a furious pace, much of it before modern earthquake codes existed. The result is a capital filled with a large share of older, more vulnerable structures, many now damaged by the June doublet standing on ground that amplifies the very shaking they are least able to survive. Soft soil and fragile buildings form a dangerous partnership, then layer on the population. 4 million people crowded into this valley means 4 million people exposed to whatever the fault delivers. Density multiplies the human cost of any earthquake. The same shaking that might harm few in an empty region can kill or injure thousands in a packed city. Caracas concentrates enormous numbers of people in a place uniquely poorly suited to withstand a great quake. Finally, consider the fault. The eastern sections of the northern fault system run near the capital, the same sections linked to the Great Quake of 1900, the same sections that dense aftershocks and satellite measurements suggest may have felt real stress from the June doublet. The danger is not distant. It runs close to the city, part of the same system that just devastated the coast 100 miles away. Put these factors together, and you have what might be called the Caracas problem. A large population, on soft amplifying soil, in vulnerable buildings near an active and dangerous fault, in a country facing enormous strain. Each factor alone is a serious risk. Together, they create a situation that keeps disaster experts deeply concerned about the capital's future. The June doublet gave a preview of what a great quake can do to the city. Towers came down in Los Palos Grandes and Altamira. Buildings across the capital were damaged, marked yellow and red, their residents displaced, and that was from a rupture centered 100 miles to the west. A great quake on a fault section right beside the city could deliver a far more direct and devastating blow. The Caracas problem is not a prophecy of doom, it is a description of risk, and risk can be reduced. But reducing it requires confronting the hard truth of the city's vulnerability and acting on it, which brings us to the most important question raised by the entire disaster. If the buildings are the killer, and the killer is one humans made, then what could be done to unmake it and save lives when the ground strikes again? Throughout this story, one truth has surfaced again and again. The earthquakes shook the ground, but the buildings killed the people. That truth carries a powerful kind of hope, because buildings can be changed. The knowledge to make structures survive great quakes already exists. The challenge is applying it before the ground strikes, rather than morning after. The central fix is strengthening buildings to withstand shaking, a process engineers call retrofitting. It involves reinforcing older, vulnerable structures so they can flex and hold rather than crack and collapse. Adding steel where it is missing, tying columns and beams together, strengthening weak ground floors, all of it aimed at helping a building bend through a quake instead of breaking. A retrofitted building can be the difference between a scare and a grave. The pattern that engineers see worldwide points straight to where the effort should go. The deadliest earthquake outcomes come not from the strongest shaking alone, but from the vulnerability of the existing buildings. In city after city across the world, the same story repeats. Old, poorly built, densely packed structures fail, while modern, well-built ones survive similar shaking. This means the path to saving lives runs through the buildings people already live in. That path has a name: pre-disaster mitigation. It means acting before the earthquake, not after. Assessing which buildings are most at risk, retrofitting the vulnerable ones, enforcing modern construction rules so new buildings are built to survive, planning for the disaster everyone knows will eventually come. It is unglamorous, expensive work, done in the quiet years, aimed at a threat that may not arrive for decades, and it saves lives on a scale nothing else can match. The tragedy is that this work is so easy to postpone. When the ground is quiet, the pressures against it are enormous. Retrofitting costs money that competing needs demand. Enforcing codes slows construction, and the threat feels distant, a problem for some future date. So the vulnerable buildings stay vulnerable year after year until the day the fault reaches its limit and the postponed work turns into catastrophe. Venezuela's disaster laid this bare. Newer buildings, constructed under modern codes, are expected to have performed markedly better than the older stock. The difference in how buildings fared was a difference written years before the quake, in how and when they were built. The lives lost in the old, fragile structures were, in a painful sense, decided long before the ground ever moved. Beyond the buildings, there are simpler fixes that protect people directly, securing heavy furniture and objects so they cannot fall and crush, having structural cracks inspected by specialists after a quake, so damaged buildings are caught before they collapse, and practicing the basic safety response that experts urge everywhere: the drop, cover and hold on that can keep a person alive in the crucial seconds of shaking. These small steps, multiplied across millions of people, save lives. The lesson of the fixes is both hopeful and demanding. The killer in this disaster was made by human choices, which means human choices can unmake it. Stronger buildings, enforced codes, secured homes, prepared people, all of it is possible, all of it is known. What it requires is the will to act in the quiet years before the fault delivers its next blow. And that next blow in some form is coming. Because even as the great quakes faded into aftershocks, the danger did not end. The weakened buildings left standing faced a threat that would linger for weeks, in the steady drumbeat of tremors that kept testing whatever the doublet had spared. The great quakes were over in seconds. The danger to the buildings was not. In the weeks that followed, a quiet, ongoing threat stalked the survivors. Structures that had endured the doublet, cracked but standing, kept collapsing in the days and weeks after, brought down by the aftershocks that refused to stop. Understanding why reveals one of the cruelest features of earthquakes. Recall how a building survives a great quake. It uses up its strength, its concrete cracks, its steel strains, its joints loosen, all of it absorbing the energy of the shaking so the structure stays upright. A building that survives the main shock is often deeply wounded, standing on borrowed strength, its safety margin spent. It looks intact from the outside, but inside it is far weaker than it was before. Now bring in the aftershocks, more than 1,000 of them in the first 2 weeks alone. Each one shakes the region again, testing every structure anew. To a healthy building, a moderate aftershock is a minor event, easily survived. But to a wounded building, one that already spent its strength surviving the doublet, that same moderate aftershock can be the final blow. The weakened structure, with nothing left to give, collapses. This is why disaster experts warned that the immediate danger was not over even after the great quakes passed. Aftershocks, though usually smaller than the main shocks, could cause additional damage to buildings weakened by the earlier shaking. A tremor too small to threaten a sound structure could finish off a damaged one. Every aftershock was a fresh test that some wounded buildings would fail. The danger this creates for people is severe and often underestimated. In the days after a great quake, survivors and rescuers move through a landscape of weakened buildings. Residents may want to return home to salvage belongings. Rescuers must enter damaged structures searching for the trapped. Inspectors must approach cracked buildings to assess them. All of them face the risk that an aftershock could bring down a weakened building around them, adding new casualties to the toll. This is precisely why the traffic light system and the reluctance to let people back into damaged buildings mattered so much. The colours were an attempt to map the wounded structures, to keep people out of the ones most likely to fail under the next aftershock. A yellow building might survive if the aftershock stayed small, or collapse if a larger one struck. The uncertainty made every damaged building a gamble. The lingering danger also complicates the timeline of recovery. A region cannot simply rebuild while aftershocks keep collapsing weakened buildings. The threat has to fade first, the aftershocks decaying over weeks and months until the ground quiets enough for safe reconstruction. Until then, the wounded buildings stand as ongoing hazards, each aftershock potentially turning one into rubble. This slow, dangerous aftermath is part of why great earthquakes cast such long shadows. The disaster does not end when the shaking stops. It stretches on through the aftershock sequence, through the collapse of weakened buildings, through the prolonged threat to everyone moving through the damaged landscape. The June doublet's danger persisted for weeks in the fragile structures it had spared but wounded. Yet even as the aftershocks tested the buildings near the original rupture, scientists watching the wider region noticed something else. Far to the east, along other sections of the Great Fault System, the ground was stirring too. The disaster's influence, it seemed, was reaching beyond the immediate zone into faults that had their own long histories of destruction. As scientists watched the seismic activity ripple across Venezuela in the weeks after the doublet, their attention was drawn eastward. Far from the original rupture along other sections of the Great Fault System, the ground was stirring. Tremors appeared near the eastern coast and offshore, in regions with their own long and dangerous histories, raising questions about how far the disaster's influence reached. The Great Fault System that runs across northern Venezuela does not stop near the capital. it continues eastward, all the way toward the island of Trinidad, passing through regions like the state of Sucre on the northeastern coast. This eastern stretch has produced significant earthquakes of its own over the years, a reminder that the danger runs the entire length of the boundary, not just where the June quakes struck. In the weeks after the doublet, notable tremors appeared in the east. Earthquakes struck near coastal towns and offshore areas, some large enough to be clearly felt. These eastern events unfolded in a region already known for seismic activity, along the same plate boundary responsible for the whole disaster. Whether they were connected to the June doublet or simply the ongoing restlessness of an active fault system, they underscored how widely the danger is spread. The eastern coast poses special challenges for scientists trying to understand the risk. Much of the fault there runs offshore beneath the sea, where instruments on land have a harder time measuring the motion. Researchers must extrapolate from measurements taken on land to understand what the offshore fault is doing, working with incomplete data. The eastern danger is partly hidden beneath the waves, harder to see and harder to forecast. This eastern activity connects to the deeper question of stress transfer that runs through the whole story. When a great earthquake ruptures part of a fault system, its influence can extend along the system, subtly changing the forces on distant sections. The tremors in the east may reflect the ongoing adjustment of a fault system disturbed by the June events, the whole great boundary settling into a new balance across hundreds of miles. The broad spread of seismic activity, from the western state of Zulia to the central regions near the rupture to the eastern coast near Sucre, paints a picture of an entire fault system in motion. Low-magnitude tremors persisted across many areas in the weeks after the doublet, a sign of a boundary zone that had been broadly disturbed. The disaster was not a single point of failure, but a shock rippling through a vast interconnected system of faults. For the people living along the eastern coast, the tremors were a reminder that they too live on the dangerous boundary. The June doublet struck to the west, but the same forces run beneath their homes. The eastern faults have their own stored energy, their own capacity for a great quake, their own place in the long, violent history of the region. The disaster to the west was a warning that applied to the entire northern belt of the country. This widespread of activity brings the story to its final and most important question. The June doublet released more than a century of stored energy along one part of the boundary, but the boundary stretches for hundreds of miles tangled with faults, loaded with stress, capable of great quakes along its entire length. So what comes next? Not just in the days ahead, but in the years and decades to come, for a nation living atop this restless and dangerous ground? We began with 39 seconds that changed a nation. We end with a question that stretches across years and decades. What comes next for Venezuela, a country living atop one of the most dangerous and restless boundaries on the planet? The answer holds both hard truths and real hope, and it rests on the choices the nation makes from here. In the immediate term, the aftershocks will continue their slow fade. The more than 1,000 tremors of the first weeks will taper off over the following months, the ground gradually settling into its new balance. The threat to weakened buildings will ease as the shaking dies down, allowing the long work of clearing rubble and rebuilding to finally begin in earnest. The acute phase of the disaster will pass, as it always does. But the deeper danger endures. The great fault system that produced the doublet still runs across the north of the country, still grinds against the moving plates, still stores its energy for future release. The June quakes relieved the stress on one section, but they may have loaded neighbouring sections, including those near the capital. The boundary stretches for hundreds of miles tangled with faults, and each one keeps its own long calendar of catastrophe. More great quakes will come. The only open question is when. For the capital of 4 million, this reality is especially urgent. The Caracas problem, of dense population, soft soil, vulnerable buildings, and a nearby active fault does not go away when the aftershocks stop. If anything, the June doublet sharpened it, both by damaging the city's buildings and by possibly loading the fault sections closest to it. The capital's long-term safety depends on confronting that vulnerability directly. Here is where the hope lives. The greatest killer in this disaster, the buildings, is one that human effort can address. Retrofitting vulnerable structures, enforcing modern construction codes, planning and preparing before the next quake, all of it can dramatically reduce the death toll of the earthquakes that are certain to come. The knowledge exists. The tools exist. What the future requires is the will to use them in the quiet years, before the fault delivers its next blow. The choice facing Venezuela is the same choice facing every society that lives on dangerous ground. Act before the disaster, or mourn after it. Strengthen the buildings now, or bury the dead later. It is a hard choice, demanding resources and attention in the calm years when the threat feels distant. But the June doublet showed, in the most brutal terms, the cost of leaving that work undone. For everyone watching from elsewhere, Venezuela's tragedy carries a universal lesson. Great earthquakes are not random acts of a hostile world. They follow patterns scientists increasingly understand, striking known faults with knowable force. The deaths they cause are shaped as much by human choices in how we build and prepare as by the raw power of the ground. That means the toll of future disasters is, in part, within human control. The ground beneath Venezuela will shake again. That much is certain. What remains unwritten is how many lives the next great quake will take, and that number will be decided not by the fault alone, but by everything the nation does in the years between now and then. The Earth has delivered its warning, twice, 39 seconds apart. What comes next depends on whether the warning is finally heard,